Duvid here. We are live post-show for the Science of Consciousness conference. So we signed up
Duvid
and
here.
been attending. It's been pretty interesting. Some of the sessions more so than others. So we're going to review the first 2 days, talk about some interesting insights that we garnered from the program. And my co-host Jennifer. So my nature is to be a little bit cheap, and because they post the videos anyways, it's like, why should I pay $300 when either could post the videos in a few months anyways? But education's important, and people support my work occasionally, and so I'll support other people's work, and certainly this is one of the fields that I want to support. It has had an open chat. Some of the sessions, the main sessions, have had more talk than others, and but a lot of it's been dead. So I'm not sure the networking. I don't think we're necessarily going to have any people from the conference that are going to be joining. I didn't even tell anybody besides for my social media. So I just bring in Jennifer here to say hello, and then I just want to share a few links related to some of the other stuff I was talking about for a minute, and then we'll go straight into talking about the conference. So, hello, Jennifer. Thanks for joining.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me, David. Welcome to the audience, and hope that everyone who's at the conference is enjoying it as much as I am.
So let me just show this real quick, and if it's interesting, because it's related to some of the stuff that I had been showing. So, Jennifer has mentioned often Giordano, famous figure in pantheism, and God forbid he was a martyr for some of his anti-church beliefs. And it was interesting. Like, I wrote my article on memory techniques, so he had actually written like a huge book on memory techniques, and I mentioned he had a Platonic understanding where memory is largely based on forms. Saying that memory is based on some sort of recognition of what's happening in the other realms as opposed to computation. I had came on to this. I shared this on Week in Review. These are older books, so they're past copyright protection. So Frances Yates was a British scholar who wrote a famous book called Art of Memory, and she did a history. Like I mentioned, Simonides of Chios, and the famous story of the banquet hall collapse, and the invention of the method of Loki, and visualization, and mnemonics, and Cicero, and various the history of memory. Great book, The Art of Memory. So I put any people are interested in scholarship, check it out. And she had a chapter on Giordano Bruno, who wrote about the seals, which there's also another character interesting. Maybe we'll talk about it at a different time. Camilio, who had the theater of memory, which was also kind of like a method of Loki, but based on Platonic forms. So I found 2 freeware books on Bruno. One has like a long bio and then an overview of some of his teachings, and one is actually a translation of some of his work, and it's pretty esoteric. I just wanted to share that. Hopefully we'll talk about that more in the future. It doesn't have too much specifically to do with the Science of Consciousness conference. So
yeah, you go into a lot of these things, they sound dated. Even as recently as Leibniz, it's hard to know what a lot of it means, language changing, and all these other newer developments with the understanding. Still worth mentioning. It's just tough to, once you like tread into it a little bit. I don't know if you've read any Leibniz, but it's maybe a similar vibe as what you're seeing with Bruno. Sort of like metaphysical ramblings. It's like, well, what does that mean exactly?
Was actually pretty systematic and kind of Euclidean, based on axioms and derivations of axioms, but it's monadic in nature. So you say that Bruno is the philosophical father kind of to Spinoza and to monism of Leibniz. And if anyone studied Kabbalistic works, actually, much of the Kabbalistic, like you would find even in the Arizal or mainstream Kabbalists, is almost exactly parallel to some of the stuff Bruno writes, although I think Bruno had a negative view towards Judaism. So just wanted to bring that in and share those links to anyone who follows my content and wants to read those to discuss more in the future. So here you have the program. So on Monday, it was just workshops. It wasn't like main speeches, and it was all specific workshops, and you had to go for one or the other. And so Monday morning, I went to, and this was actually Pacific time. I thought it was Mountain time, but it's 3 hours earlier than Eastern time. So there's going to be another program at midnight. So we're going to go for about 2 hours and then stop because Deepak Chopra and Sue Blackmore have their program at 9 p.m., which is midnight my time. So the last planetary session is ending now. So Monday, I attended the Testing OR, Orchestrated Objective Reduction, and Embedded Intelligence. Which ones did you go to?
Oh, just give me a second. I'm going to need to pull that up so that I can refer to it. I was jumping around here. Okay, so wait, where are we?
This is page 18. So they had 4 different ones. And I said,
session name, Progression on Dual Aspect Thinking. I got sucked into that one without realizing they were for like, it was super early. I was confused. So I ended up on that one, and I was impressed with that. And then I went on to quantum mechanics and consciousness, and I sort of hopped around.
I mentioned Justin Riddle. I've been sharing some of his videos on Week in Review because he talks regularly about orchestrated objective reduction, OR, and so eventually I'll watch all of these. And so I just picked one and stuck with it. And I was actually playing chess at the same time. So for the first one, in the afternoon, I got more into it, especially after Stuart Hameroff gave his presentation on embedded intelligence, and that was very detailed. And I had a few main points I wanted to talk about, but the exact way that we test or understand what is orchestrated objective reduction. Exactly. On the last conference, I went over some slides to explain the theory and how do you go about testing it? What type of biological, physiological mechanisms are there, and the latest updates. So I'm not enough of an expert to really give something too much insightful, and I was just getting into the conference. But and then probably more interesting to talk about was the evening workshop on neurospirituality, where they had Michael Ferguson from Harvard Medical School and the Divinity School, because he's Mormon and been doing interfaith, and he did a bunch of MRI scans on people when they're having religious experiences. And they had a few other panelists. One of them, Rick Straussman, had written on Kabbalah in Hebrew prophecies. But in that one, there was actually a semi-lively, active chat with the other participants, although it doesn't look like they're actually taking questions to put to the panelists from the Zoom callers. So it was just us talking amongst ourselves. But it was pretty interesting, and hopefully we'll talk about that. Did you have something quick you want to say about any of the Monday sessions, the quantum mechanics and consciousness, or progress on dual aspect? And which one did you say you went to in the afternoon? Plants and consciousness?
I hopped around. I wanted to make sure I got a vibe of like, and I went to the entire neurospirituality one, but consciousness and non-locality impressed me, as well as the number of mentions of entanglement and how, I don't have it all organized as to which one was which right now. So bear with me a moment.
Okay, they have the more abstracts and details. So today, the conference was the first session was just kind of workshops, and I guess a lot of people maybe even skip that. Like, my father's been, a medical doctor. He goes to conferences all the time, and my mother is a lawyer in these type conferences, and to some extent, we'll talk. I want to talk about the nature of interdisciplinary studies, who goes to these and why they go to them, and if you're an expert and you need to go to these, like like your doctor usually have required ongoing education requirements, and I think my father goes to 2 conferences a year at least. That most doctors I think are required to go to 1 or 2 conferences a year minimally, just to keep their license. And lawyers, some states have ongoing education, versus people, maybe younger people that are part of programs that are sent to these on behalf of their institute to, call lay people like me and Jennifer who just are really interested in the topic. And so some conferences may not even be open to lay people, like medical conferences may have requirements that maybe they sell tickets to lay people. I'd have to look into that. But this one clearly, is open to everybody, although it's, designed for academics. So we're going to talk about, the nature of interdisciplinary studies, and I had a little interesting talks in one of the chats today with other participants or attendees. So the morning meditation with Deepak Chopra wasn't streamed, and so I guess that was live. They had in the morning sleep, wakefulness, and anesthesia, and that included University of Michigan's Center for Conscious Science, which is also in the medical school related to anesthesiology, is one of the sponsors, together with the Center of Consciousness Studies at University of Arizona, related to the medical school anesthesiology. And so they talked about what do we know currently about sleep, wakefulness, and anesthesia. And we've mentioned this many times that consciousness studies is housed in anesthesia and anesthesiology, and that is where consciousness studies is usually put in the medical field, unless you're taking in theology or philosophy, and then they wouldn't have like a house of consciousness study. They might have a course on consciousness. So it was an update from some of the bigger experts on the current knowledge, and a lot of this is pretty technical in terms of anatomy and physiology, and a lot of terminology that most people would have never heard of about anatomical structures and physiological hormones, or like genes, or the different particles in the brain that they measure. But that was extremely interesting. Then the keynote was Christopher Koch from the Allen Institute, who was talking about the neural correlates of consciousness. And he's one of the big name in consciousness studies. He's the head of the Allen Institute. They're well funded, and he was even talking about funding other people's research. Has mentioned a lot, publishing and the peer review, that they have a double-blind process. So that was a pretty good overview. And then in the afternoon, they had brain connectivity, where they're just more further on the neurocorrelates of consciousness, where what we know about measurement of the brain related to consciousness. And I guess Hammerl was a big fan of this Anirban Bandyapade, who I guess is currently in Japan, and he went over the latest research into what we know about neurons, the finer detail, and that was pretty interesting. Although all these were pretty interesting. And then just right now, right before we started streaming, they had breakout sessions. One of the hard problem, brain and consciousness, AI machine consciousness, and quantum state reduction. And I went to the AI machine consciousness one, which was kind of slow and boring. It was a little interesting. They actually had the Bach, who's a regular guest, popular guest on Theories of Everything, and has somewhat of a media personality for the issue. I'd recommended Jennifer go to quantum state reduction because that's something closer to her area of research, although she might have bounced around. So that's leads
Well,
us up.
I did check that one out, and it was interesting until the misunderstanding of entanglement was just so egregious. But I don't want to go into that too much right now. I'll let you finish what you're saying here.
Well, that puts us up to date, and I'll look more. I'll go further the program a little bit more and look at some of the abstracts and say 9 to 10 will be the dialogue between Mystery of Existence, why is there sentience, a dialogue between Sue Blackmore and Deepak Abstract Chopra, and so we'll probably end by midnight so we could catch the last program tonight. And I said that it's on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, so it'll be midnight my time, 9 p.m. their time. So I'm not sure if you want to mention anything on today's program, and I'm going to bring up the more details on today's program.
Might as well go into the details on today's program, and I can mention it. Then I was just saying, like, I was totally into it to see what they were doing, and then they were talking about synthetically causing entanglement, and I thought that was a concern because the idea is that the Copenhagen interpretation did not mention entanglement directly, yet our experiments keep pointing in that direction. And to attempt to set up a situation of entanglement means it's presupposing you understand what it means to set up entanglement. So that's not scientific. Scientific would be, what does it mean that something is entangled? And go in that direction to see, is my assumption about what it means for something to be entangled justified? Not, I'm going to synthetically generate entanglement and then tell myself that it was what I created, because this is going to be a lot like, what is the one where they established, I want to say Bell's inequality, but which is the proof that is said to have established that there are no non-local hidden variables, or local hidden variables, sorry. Do you know what I'm talking
about?
No. Should know this one. Yeah. Hidden variable theory. Yeah, it's Bell's inequality. So that may be true, but then, it sort of gives the wrong idea. It's a bit like with Gödel's theorem. It's like, it's true within its own axioms. It's definitely correct technically, but what does that truth actually tell us is sort of where the confusion maybe could potentially arise. Just want to mention that.
Okay, yeah. So Christopher Koch is one of the big names, and you can see he's his Wikipedia page. He had worked for the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and is the head of the Allen Institute in Seattle. Is well funded. He's written over 300 papers and 5 books on how computers and neurons process information, and is one of the key people in the integrated information theory, the attempt to provide a framework capable of explaining why some physical systems are conscious. So he was talking about the neurocorrelates of consciousness, and that was the keynote today. Tomorrow's keynote will be Robin Carthart-Harris on psychedelics, and I guess he's at the University of California, San Francisco, and there's actually a division of Neuroscape psychedelics division, and so that will hopefully be interesting. Avi Loeb, the Harvard Israeli professor, will be Thursday, as will David Chalmers. And so in the morning, University of Michigan, Gino Carlo Vanni is from the Department of Anesthesiology, and has dual training in medicine and neuroscience, and I think he's Italian, and said he looked focuses on the understanding of brain circuitry underlying the regulation of arousal states of sleep and wakefulness, and how these neural systems contribute to a fluctuation of consciousness levels across spontaneous sleep-wake states, the recovery of consciousness from general anesthesiology, the sleep-pain interface, the relationship between postoperative sleep disturbances and cognitive function. And to this end, the lab combines behavior assays, analysis of EEG rhythms and dynamics, neurochemical monitoring, recording calcium-dependent neural activity, and so on. And there's a paper here on preoptic hypothalamic mechanisms controlling sleep-wake states do not influence the loss and recovery of consciousness associated with isoflurane anesthesia. Despite 175 years of continuous clinical use of general anesthesics, the precise mechanisms by which these drugs reversibly suppress consciousness remains unknown. So it's pretty interesting that anesthesiology, obviously people have surgery, it works, people use it, but the exact mechanism of why it works is largely unknown. And so we're talking in the chat, the nature of medicine, which is patient-centric, where medicine has a purpose to help the patient and not necessarily like straight science of understanding something. And he put up 3 theories of an explanation: the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis and the microtubules would be an alternative explanation. Obviously, Dr. Hameroff, also an anesthesiologist. That was pretty interesting. I'll share that definitely when they post it. University of Michigan here, my alma mater, my father alumni from the medical school also. Matthew Larkham, professor of neuronal plasticity. The lab are based on unifying hypothesis that the incredible cognitive power of the cortex derives from an associative mechanism built at the cellular level, such that the architecture of the cortex is tightly coupled with the computational capabilities of single cells. In essence, this hypothesis places no importance in the computational power of neurons that has ramifications for our understanding of cognition and for neurodegenerative diseases that disturb neural properties. So you say, I'm going to talk more. I'm just going to finish going over, what we heard today, and we see that there's a lot of unknowns in terms of consciousness. In medicine, there's a lot known in terms of what we could do to help people who have certain impairments, how to administer anesthesia, what to read when a person's under anesthesia, to conduct a successful surgery, the understanding of what happens in certain neurodegenerative disorders. But the actual understanding of consciousness, neural correlates of consciousness, his son Christopher Kaka gave the update of basically the current understanding is rather weak. And then there was another University of Pennsylvania.
Are you saying generally the understanding of consciousness is weak?
Well, yeah.
It's funny because I would say that it's stronger than ever in this field, but I see what you're saying also.
Well, yeah, I'm saying it's at the highest it's ever been, but in terms of solving the hard problem of consciousness, now at this
it's like
point,
being the smartest,
the experts are much less ambitious or think that they're on the brink of actually solving the hard problem of consciousness. So here you have Alex Proch, the scientific inquiry into mechanisms through which anesthesias act to induce a reversible state of unconsciousness are intrinsically linked to the study of consciousness per se. Anesthesic mechanisms can be addressed at a number of levels, from detailed understanding of molecular interactions between receptors and anesthetic compounds to their effects on individual neurons and neuronal circuits. So he talked about mechanisms of anesthesia at a more macroscopic level. Then the global brain dynamic consciousness emerges as a consequence of complex bidirectional interactions between the brain and the environment. At this level, the effect of the anesthesics can be broadly conceptualized as decoupling the brain from the environment. So he talked to the first offer hypothesis that In order to enable the complex and flexible coupling between the brain and the environment, brain dynamics must be critical and provide some experimental support for the hypothesis using spontaneous brain activity in humans and non-human primates. And also some of their recent tests. I mentioned Christopher Koch and the Allen Institute. Then in the afternoon, they had more sessions on brain connectivity. First researcher focusing, Jean-Remy King, focusing on understanding the computational basis of human cognition, paradigms, methods, and model to analyze brain activity. Another from University of Michigan, Cyril Hong, research assistant professor in Department of Anesthesiology, multidisciplinary background, including psychology, biology, cognitive neuroscience, and neuroimaging. Primary research lies in the investigating the neural substrates of consciousness, studies the mechanistic role of large-scale brain networks in conscious cognition, and the alternation by means of pharmacological, neuropathological, and psychiatric manipulation of consciousness using functional MRI. Has published over 45 scientific articles. And then Zero Hong, also from the University of Michigan Medical School, anesthesiology, evidence for the non-invasive function neuroimaging studies that pointed to two distinct cortical systems that may mediate the ongoing stream of human consciousness as internally directed system, default mode network, and an internally directed system, dorsal attention network. Discussed how the two systems unfold over time in the conscious brain, how they disrupted when consciousness is diminished. Elaborate the concept of the temporal circuit, which is characterized by a set of trajectories along which the dynamic brain activity occurs. Also present an extended work in which the level and context of consciousness were manipulated using independent test fMRI protocols. It will show that anterior insula is situated between unimodal and transmodal cortical areas along the brain's primary function gradient, regulates the default mode, dorsal attention network transition, and gate consciousness access of sensory information. And finally, it talked about the brain's multidimensional functional landscape and introduced a common macro scale neurofunctional framework that can account for both normal and altered states of consciousness. Evidence from non-invasive functional neuroimaging studies has pointed to two distinct cortical systems that may mediate the ongoing stream of human consciousness. So all of those were pretty interesting. And then Anirban Bandyapade from Japan working on the cavity resonator model of human brain and design synthesis of brain like organic jelly, worked with MIT. For centuries, believed that everything inside the membrane remains silent when a nerve spike propagates. Using nanotechnology, a coaxial probe, we measured the filaments contribute to neural firing, not by initiating the firing, but by fine-tuning the spike timing, regulating the ion channel release. In the microscope, the optical circuit that we see is not a true picture of the neural network. If we use dielectric resonance camera, we will see a very different picture of the brain circuit. Neural circuit is not a linear circuit as a model for the century. On the contrary, fractal-like network where the scale-free symmetry and vibration and proteins extend to the entire brain body neural networks. So that was it for today. Then they had the plenaries. Let me just, so tonight is going to be Sue Blackmore and Deepak Chopra in an hour and a half from now. So we're definitely looking forward to that coming up tonight. But wanted to make the most out of this. So if we restream, talk about it a little bit. So they had 4 sessions tonight. The heart problem one looked pretty interesting. I ended up going to the AI one, which was interesting. One of the speakers from Italy, where the conference next year is going to be, spoke, and Anatoly Shella, and like a think tank talking about robotics, and as I mentioned, Joshua Bach, who is a frequent guest on Theories of Everything with Kurt Jaimungal, gave an overview talk about the origins of consciousness and evolution of governments in the society of mind. It's reasonably interesting. The quantum state reduction one looked interesting, but said they were concurrent, so wasn't able to go to more than one at a time. So that is my general review of the program today. So I'm not sure if you want to add on your thoughts, and then hopefully we'll talk some interesting issues, general consciousness. But I wanted to just give a general view of what we saw, and then we'll talk more about what it means, and me and Jennifer's area of research.
My impressions are that I was very happy that they were talking about entanglement, entangled photons, waveform reduction, as opposed to wave function collapse. And that tells me that there's a lot of growth of understanding, because a lot of this is just figuring out what the instruments are actually telling us. So this idea that consciousness can be modeled, and that somehow the neurons are, analogous to a computer. However, that may be true is certainly not self-evident. And it does seem like, Hamroff didn't go into it too much, but he did mention the Platonic order type stuff. Like, I don't know if any of that sort of jumped off the page to you, but it seemed very positive in terms of learning, but there's still a big gap in terms of understanding the ethical implications. Like, I sincerely hope that there won't be reckless, buffoonish, playing God tier excursions into consciousness now that its a basic mechanism is understood. It should be, very carefully that these topics are approached, because thinking that you can use a computer to access the contents of someone's mind, well, no, the lesson is that consciousness is an interferential process, and so any measurement of consciousness is going to disturb it, and so all your measurements have to be justified on the basis of there's going to be some disturbance. So you can think of it as somehow analogous to taking your blood pressure. Well, the pressure and the annoyance of that, it's considered worth it because the doctor now knows something about your state of health. Well, it ought to be the same level, even higher, of caution with consciousness, and that would be my sort of hope for the future. And I don't know that the tech is really advanced enough that we can make that call, but I did notice a lot of quite measured tones and sober reflections. It appeared in the tones of voice of a lot of people that they were more serious. And then there were some not so serious ones. Like one of these ones I went into, a guy was talking about rats and bunnies and calling his coworker a rat. And it was just weird. I guess you missed that, but just a general comment, like these inside jokes, it is a conference, right? Like, do people want to be taken seriously? Like, I don't know. It's just a side comment.
Okay. Well, people know my thoughts on humor in general, and people know also that I debate T-Jump and others and JF, and saying that the hard problem that consciousness doesn't in fact arise from the brain. And I was talking in the chat about what we call the neural correlates of consciousness. Could it be referred to as the neural correlates of the soul, and a solution to the interaction problem? And you say the brain as a receiver, that as opposed to trying to figure out how the brain creates consciousness, to actually focusing on what the brain actually does. So a lot of scientists are doctors, researchers are overambitious about what exactly they're going to be able to discover, and think that they're going to be able to explain consciousness arising from the brain. And because the research has not really been supportive in moving in that direction. And I've even reached the point, I argue with T-Jump, that you could almost conclusively argue that consciousness does not arise from the brain as a proof of the soul, that, believing in a dualist or a separate realm, because we have this phenomenon of consciousness, and the evidence that it arises from the brain is actually very wanting. And so usually there's a consensus among scientists to be materialists that, oh, we're on the verge of explaining why and how consciousness arises from the brain. And, so as Jennifer said, this was much more sober, that to say they're really not on the verge of discovering it. And from, like a Duvidism to say they should just give it up and say that, no, they're not going to discover. So High Dog Pluto and Charlie Brown Lives. Um, so, I had here, I showed this book, George Boole, and he has another book. This is one of his other books, a collection, Studies in Logic and Probability. So, I guess we have another hour and a half. I'm going to show these
We
slides.
can go into that a little bit. I've got a model that I would be happy to share about a possible conflation about probability, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, and the likes.
Let me
and
show.
I just had this idea last time, but anyway, I'll get it ready. Do you like?
Okay, so let me go over these slides, and you just give a little presentation on, because we had a little misunderstanding on Week in Review about computer intelligence, and kind of playing around with words. What does it mean, computer intelligence, and what does it mean when I say that it's almost been conclusively shown that this is not what's occurring in our brain? So I was mentioning digital logic circuits, and saying goes back to Boole, who was the main attributed discoverer of these 150 years ago. And see that you don't actually have to have electrical circuits. Originally they used vacuum tubes, and just the simple logic of how thought or computer intelligence derives from Boolean logics. And so Boolean, there's basically just three functions, and there's a adaptation on those functions. There's and, or not, and those are created, like in a logic table, like it's either a, if a equals 1, not a equals 0. If a equals 0, not a equals 1. And the basic logic table where you have two units and they both have to be true to give a positive value, or an or where only one of them has to be true to give a positive value. So here you can see a simple truth table of an and circuit, like a two input A and B. So A and B both have to be true to have a 1. And if only one of the true is true, you get a 0. You could have a multiple input one that all of them have to be true to give a 1, or the or, where if any of them are true, you get a 1 positive value. And you'll see that there's also a NAND and a slight adaptation on it. And in terms of
so they're already using a very rudimentary version of a quaternary logic system.
Yeah, I mean, so as I'm going to show, like, you could see at the end, like, you could be in a high school electronics class and design a basic circuit that could do addition like this. So like now, like show that, and I actually took, circuitry physics at Stony Brook, and we designed basic logic gates. But this circuitry, like a binary, and I'm not going to go into it too much in depth now. I just want to quickly, really is at the heart of all computation and computer logic. And you can see you create like a gate that could do addition or subtraction or multiplication. And so they have these simple machines that you could use just to test single circuits. I'll show these slides if, this is kind of basic, electronics, and here's more to show the larger level of circuitry that would be used. And I'm going to relate it to the brain, where an and circuitry. So you could create mathematical logic from these simple logical signals, and that's kind of like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But even something like Stephen Wolfram is Mathematica, all of it derives from these simple circuits. Everything to complex algebra, and even to Boole in the 1850s, before computers, talked about how you would program calculus, how you would program circuits. Babbage had a calculating machine. We argued on Week in Review whether abacus is intelligent. And so to say, an abacus takes a human help to make the computations, but the abacus itself, so to say, makes the calculations successfully. It takes a human manipulation. Babbage, there were mechanical calculators, before the electronic era, and instead the first computers were vacuum tubes, not electric. In terms of related to a likelihood, so the concept that the brain has these Boolean gates or something similar to that creates thought is largely unproven. That's why I argue with T-Jump that I don't think consciousness arises from the brain, period. And just because the computer could create thought using these binary and logic gate circuits, and our brain has electrical neurons, that our brain actually uses a similar method of the computer, it has been unproven. And so I didn't argue just is thought part of consciousness, and even whether the thought function occurs in the brain. However, we do know in the brain that sense perception occurs and motor control, although like the controller of how you control it. So you could have a basic circuit, and like I show my engineering conferences where I go around and like automotive testing expo. And, so here I mentioned even last week saying intelligence of a device like automatic nightlight, where you just have a simple AND gate, and you have a motion sensor and a light sensor. And if the motion sensor senses motion and the light sensor doesn't sense light, it puts on the light. So the light, you'd have a NAND gate, a NOT gate, to say that you don't want to sense light, and then that with the motion would go through an AND gate. And if both of those are true, it causes the light to go on. And it's a basic circuit that all types of device. You could have circuit logic too. So you could have a device, like a automatic nightlight, that doesn't have circuit logic. It doesn't have any logical if-then programs. It just has a gate, a sensor, and if both of those trip the signal, it puts the lights on. And just like an open gate or a closed gates. As to say here, you could see originally there were relays, then vacuum tubes, then the discrete transistor, then the integrated circuit. So saying this existed before electronics, as say within the vacuum tube, or even mechanical devices that perform these. So it's not, like neurons are electric. Now we use computers, but these logical, computational, so to say, intelligence, if you want to use that word, does not necessitate electronics. Say Moore's law of the transistor now, where you could have millions, billions of circuits on this 2006. I guess these are older slides, but now it's already billions. And even say that now the computer unquestionably outperforms the human mind, even to the point to think that it's unlikely that neurons do some sort of function like this, although they probably do in terms of sense perception, but whether like there's a circuit logic or code, like they call higher order thinking, like the prefrontal cortex, where they mentioned that there would be some area of the brain that would have neurons that basically function as logic circuits, like transistors that have use what we would call Boolean logic to have higher order rules that would determine even motor control. So like actually abstract thought, whether that could occur in the brain, I would say no. But if you were talking about sense perception to the controller of the human body, so here's a giving example, like a car alarm, a fire sprinkler, and really simple circuits that take in these various things and will create an action. So in terms of whether you're talking about higher order thinking, I think in the prefrontal cortex, that there would be the sense perception, and it would go through some sort of logical circuitry, which is in, they discuss the various parts of the brain it would likely to be, and going through those higher order rules would control the body. And in terms of, what do we do in like human action? And that is relatively demonstrated, that we know, we could trace the neural circuits of a sense perception, even, vision, but, something like touch or pressure, that if I feel something on my hand and so I'll close these slides down. Hopefully on Week in Review, maybe we'll go more over some of this in the future, just as the academic, but just to finish the point. So from, I'll add Jennifer's in a second. So like, like touch, if I touch something or there's heat or pressure, that goes very specifically. We know exactly, if you're a medical doctor, you have it memorized, what the spinal cord, the neuron, the exact anatomy, going from the various sensors to the spinal cord, to the brain, through, Hameroff demonstrated through, the prefrontal cortex, and even through the various parts of the brain, and where it might be processed, and then a signal might go back out to cause an action. So if you touch something hot, you remove your hand, that may not even need to go to the brain. It's possible that there could be in the spinal cord itself, would cause a reaction. In that sense, like a mechanical device, it's very likely that our body operates the exact same way as the machine, in the way of the logic gate circuit, where there's some sort of the neuron
I was
would
just
be.
thinking maybe because like consciousness in the sense of being awake or asleep, you're either asleep or awake, maybe. So there's a vibe of decidability that is similar to what the Boolean circuit does. Because I agree that it's appealing to think there is an analogy there to be made with computers.
Well, I mean, it's not appealing. I'm saying it's factual that you could reduce the neurological mechanism, and it's exactly similar. In fact, the exact same as the circuit logic. That's been conclusively demonstrated, that certain aspects of sense perception or reflexes is, although they have the exact neuron, like the exact gate, like AND gate, is still a matter. But I'm saying most of the experts say that it's the exact same. There's absolutely no difference between the electrical circuit or device that is used and how the human body does. And that's why I mentioned intelligence is not something unique of humans. If you want to say intelligence is this form, this separate identity that is used by humans and it's used by computers. And in this instance, there's no difference in the way that a computer manipulates this form of intelligence from the human body manipulating intelligence. And that was the point I was trying to make on Week in Review, that even if you had circuit logic, so most attempts to solve the hard problem of consciousness, as I was saying, it's not anthropomorphism of mapping the human onto the computer. It's actually the opposite, where we map the computer on to the human, because we know exactly how the computer functions, the circuits. We build computers up from circuits, and because we could have computers and machines do such complex functions, that then we try to understand humans doing those same functions the way the computer. So it's the opposite of anthropomorphism, and it's unclear how accurate that is. Say for certain aspects like sense perception, motor control, it's more likely. For thought, it's unclear, and then the heart problem, the controller, that if there is higher order rules, higher order thought that controls the perception, there's still no controller. That the arisal, like you say, the computer doesn't have a controller, and the anthropomorphism of assuming that the human has a controller and the computer doesn't, that would be an anthropomorphization of the computer to give the computer will. Although from a materialistic understanding of consciousness, will doesn't necessarily exist in the human either. That's possibly a false theological assumption, or it's as Hameroff was going over the Libet study on the delayed reaction when a person says they're going to do something versus the signal from the brain, and that the person thinks they're going to do something after the brain has already signaled that they're going to do it. And so that consciousness is an after the fact, and the feel of the control of the body is actually an illusion. That would put like consciousness is an illusion, but to say the concept of the controller of the body is an illusion, and basically the brain.
I don't know that it's saying that. It's just saying there's a delay. But are you saying anthropomorphism is like if I thought my computer was conscious, that would be anthropomorphism, and so ascribing computer qualities to human consciousness would be maybe a reverse anthropomorphism? Because I want to use the right word, and yeah, you're right, it isn't the same thing. So would you agree with it's reverse anthropomorphism?
Yeah, I have to think if there's actually a word for that. But for example, like anthropomorphizing viruses, like the virus wants to, and say, well, it's unclear that the virus wants or has desires. That's an anthropomorphizing, and saying that the computer wants to, or the computer decides to. You would call it like an anthropomorphization, but to say the computer thinking is probably not an anthropomorphization. It's probably a correct understanding. So talk about computer intelligence, that's not an anthropomorphization. That's why saying that Boolean logic existed before the computer, and it's an abstract, and saying that intelligence and thinking is an abstract concept that doesn't necessitate a human to do it. And it just happens that humans have the function of intelligence and thought, but other things also have the function of intelligence and thought. So talking about intelligence and thought are not even aspects of consciousness at all. To put that, to say, to question whether thought and intelligence are even aspects of consciousness. And you look, that I always mention when I debate T-Jump or talk to Ben Watkins, to separate the controller and thought. And so the aspect of anthropomorphization is the controller, that there is no independent controller I in the computer. There's just code that operates, and the code is programmed by someone else. So there is no I operator that controls.
There is an independent controller. It's the user of the computer. It's inanimate without a user. I don't want to come back on the same thing. I don't understand how this argument, how you think this, I don't know if you think this argument works or what, but anyway, it's.
Well, I think you have to learn computer science.
It'll be more obvious in the future what the answer is. Like
I started in computer science and programming, and I said the logic circuits. And if you're trying to make, you're saying if you're just ignorant of computer science, and you're trying to make a point about something, you don't know what you're talking about, or you're saying if you're actually validly trying to make a point, and you're saying
I'm trying to push the conversation forward, and I realize a lot of times we end up talking past each other because we're just not clicking. Like I'm perhaps skipping too many steps in what it is that I'm trying to say. So
you want to say the user.
I'm not just trying to be a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian. Absolutely not. I'm just working. My thoughts always How do we reframe so that the way we're putting is conducive to reaching the answer? So the way I would say to frame it is computation a subset of consciousness, or is consciousness a subset of computation? And so the brain emergent people, the brain emergent consciousness school, I think they're basically saying that they're saying the latter. They're saying consciousness is a subset of computation. And that just doesn't hold up.
Well, I'm not sure who you think is saying that. Who's saying that computation is a subset of or that consciousness is a subset of computation?
No one is explicitly saying that. I am doing what you're saying your MTH does, which is trying to axiomatically decompose. So subtext reading based on content down to a model that actually predicts the outcome. And those would appear to be the two worldviews that generate these incompatible vantages. And Dog Pluto says you weren't finished your point, so please go ahead if you had another point in there that I missed.
Yeah, so I was, the direction of consciousness to these understanding of how computers operate, and then to break down terminology. That what do we understand as thought and intelligence, and if we're going to separate that from the human ability to produce that and say it's independently produced, and say consciousness is related to the experience of the controller, or if you want to use the word controller, if how you relate that to a computer. If you say a computer is the user, even the controller, is that even a proper understanding of what we mean by controller? How are we trying to understand consciousness? So I wanted to talk about the interdisciplinary studies to you really understand this, and that's what I meant. People are talking past each other in the chat, because consciousness is going to take interdisciplinary studies, and different fields have different axioms, and sometimes they're conflicting. And if you're talking about computers, artificial intelligence, mathematics, information theory, the way that terms are used might be different. And then if you're talking philosophy or theology, then obviously then your biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, it's very difficult to advance interdisciplinary theory. And I was mentioning that the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis that leaves open the potential for the brain as a receiver. That Penrose is more talking about information theory and quantum state reduction as an ability to produce information or make computations, or if you want to define the words in a different way according to the physics understanding, then information theory. And then Hameroff gives a mechanism for how that might possibly happen in the brain, but it's a superposition of a combination, Penrose, of physics and information theory onto biology. And then, so if you accepted Penrose's understanding of quantum physics and information theory, and you just needed a mechanism, like I was mentioning Boolean logic, that he came up with a logic before there was a mechanism. And it doesn't have to be electrical circuits. It could be relays or vacuum tubes or even mechanical circuits. It was an idea that needed some sort of mechanism to test the idea. And so Penrose's The Emperor's Mind is more an abstract idea of information theory that Hameroff, the anesthesiologist, gives a physical mechanism how that may operate. and then it tries to superimpose this one discipline onto the biological mechanisms in a similar way to like a computer, where say Boolean logic predates the computer, and Boolean logic is not exactly, it's been changed. There's De Morgan's law, there's other things to how circuit logic works today. But to some extent, once we had a device, starting with the relay, then the vacuum tube, and the integrated circuit, then we were able to apply Boolean logic and saying, so Boole had already described how to use logic circuits to solve calculus problems 100 years before the integrated circuit. And to some extent, like Wolfram,
numerical brute forcing in solving a calculus problem isn't quite the same level of computational transcendence. Just to, not that it's not a big deal. Like, I think it's probably a bigger, more impressive, a lot of these mechanical feats, frankly, than the theoretical ones. But just saying, it's not the same thing. And this is where the interdisciplinary leap is so important, is that we have two extremes, like what you mentioned with the biology integrating into AI. The people who work in these fields will admit they do not have a physics understanding like quantum physics understanding. So the question is, how do we reconcile those fields, ideally not leaving anyone behind, and sort of drill down to why we can't do that now with no problems? Is, if I could put it shortly, would be that in spite of paying lip service to science, people can't draw the line from the tech we have now that we can point to and be like, awesome, and what, like, where did science give us refrigerators? And because we can't do that, we're mixing up, like, okay, sorry, it's not because, it's, we're mixing up the math and the physics right now, and we can't disentangle them because we're kind of stuck. Because effectively, science is playing the role of metaphysics or theology or philosophy, and science is an implementation of philosophy. And there's a reason for that. And when you switch the order, you have a hard time correcting for errors. So that's why I've got this diagram here. I'm sure it's very annoying, a lot of words, but this was the smallest number of concepts I could get as a sort of fork that I could use only words in that list to justify, number one, what consciousness is, number two, why science works. I could basically explain all the process relations. It may not be the most coherent way to express the process relations. Like, if you ask me to express religion in this structure, it's going to sound stupid and horrible because it's not the right structure for it. But the power of this structure here is that it doesn't explicitly mention consciousness. Now, why would we want that? Well, because it's a subjective first-person experience, consciousness, and you see all the crazy theories out there that people get for consciousness, thinking you can somehow write your own thoughts. Obviously, if we're looking at what's happening today as a basis of evidence for science, we can say, well, it's really easy to make mistakes as regards to understanding of consciousness. Therefore, we want a theory that understands consciousness correctly, that doesn't force us to think about consciousness much because we suck at it. And evidence, have a look literally anywhere. So that was sort of the argument here. Notice how the closest we actually get to consciousness is the term observation. And that is enough because of how generically quantum mechanics has been defined and modern field theory in general. There's a heck of a lot of conflation going on. And this is one of the, I did this diagram and I hope it's not too confusing, but basically if you look at these two descriptions on the left at the top and the second from the top, these are different fields, but the wording is very similar. And if you think about, like, what does it mean to actually read? People aren't reading word by word. That's another illusion, like individualism and objectivity, as we would think of it, without any initiation, right? So what we're recognizing is the structure of the pattern, and then it seems like we're identifying things in it, but no, the things we identify have no meaning outside the pattern, and the patterns themselves, we have access to almost zero of the pattern. So the point with this being that given that these are worded, I can word, like, one of them is taken out of Wiki. The other one, I just reworded quantum to sound as much like that as it could. And notice the structure could be made almost identical, but they're saying essentially different things. If you have any experience with physics, you see these two concepts, although they're indistinguishable from a measurmental perspective, they are not conceptually equivalent if you have any experience in this field. So anyway, that's not to get too much on a rant here, but I do feel as though I have something to say with regards to consciousness. I just think that I haven't said it in the most straightforward way. And thanks for your patience, David, and hopefully it can be more straightforward going forward now that I have a better understanding of where other people are coming from through experience.
Yeah, is that all you... Did you have anything more you wanted to show, or that's it?
That was all on that particular topic, but there was also, this one. I've mentioned this before about the ethics thing. I mean, how do we know that this isn't conscious? Brain, like, waves are a sign of consciousness, so maybe this lab-grown thing is conscious. Is that ethical? Well, probably not ethical just to be randomly creating conscious transponders or forks or what have you. And then, just saying. Don't want this. I mean, this sort of technology is arguably what started the Mahabharat War. So just, I'm not like just being a wet blanket for nothing, just saying. And other than that, I did a couple diagrams about, I think I might have sent one to you about a matter fork, but I wasn't sure if this would be more or less clarifying, but shape of the period, the complement of the shape of the periodic table looks like a fork, kind of. So I was saying consciousness is fork-like, and you can kind of see it in the tree. The structure of plants have this forkish structure. I don't know if that's the right term. Someone had a different term in the chat, and I've already forgotten what it was. Hey, Memes, nice to see you. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is another one of those my diagrams don't make sense to anyone but me thing, but yeah, we can take it in any direction you want. That was all I had to say on that. And yeah, if anyone wants to come on and chat, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm just going to go for an hour more because we paid for this, and Deepak Chopra is in an hour. So yeah, I had an interesting chat last night on neurospirituality, and some of my debates against like T-Jump and JF or just conversations. You're talking, they say that Ben Watkins, the expression the universe is indifferent to suffering, and if you say that morality is ethics is a construct of mind that doesn't correspond to physical reality. I mean, saying, okay, the I of my consciousness is bothered when I'm in pain, or is bothered when other people are in pain, but the universe, the scientific laws are not bothered by pain. Like the Ahimsa principle is a construct, according to like a non-dualistic understanding, is a construct of mind, and mind, if it arises purely from circuitry similar to a computer of logics and higher order thought, and eventually it's explained how the circuitry arises into thought and consciousness, and the controller is said the consensus understanding is that good and bad is simply a construct of mind that doesn't correspond to physical laws. And that's why I mentioned spiritually, the dualistic understanding is that no, the Ahimsa principle, karma, good and bad are actually laws of nature, but they don't function on the physical plane. They function on a separate plane, a spiritual plane, and consciousness, like in a Platonic sense that people say is panpsychism intrinsically Platonic. And if you're saying that consciousness is like this spiritual realm where these things function and they're not a construct of mind, they're actually a factual element of the world. And I think it's a complicated concept. People don't have a background in theology.
I tried to deduce it on T-jumps there. I was basically saying if panpsychism is true, then through evolution, we should become more conscious, which ought to drive empathy, which ought to drive benevolence. So at least within ourselves, we seem to be going towards a higher ability to meaningfully incorporate others into our reasoning, which would seem to be on the path to morality. Now, obviously, I think modern state of affairs is quite degraded, but what I said still stands.
Well, Hameroff talked about what he called the pleasure principle, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
I mean, I could delve into Hindu arguments about an impersonal benevolence, and I don't know how much that would be worthwhile, but they're certainly around.
Yeah, well, you can do that in the future. It's probably worthwhile, but not for tonight. And just if we talk the pure logic and reason of what does it mean panpsychism or pan consciousness, to say that the classic model that's in the Vedas, the Talmud, Descartes, the Greeks, that the mind is that the consciousness is received, and if the brain is the element that receives this consciousness, that historically maybe they thought it was the pineal gland, and if Hameroff's right, it's these microtubules. But what is this consciousness that's received? And even Penrose, if you're just talking about quantum state reduction as a method of information theory, what exactly is this consciousness that's received? What's the nature of it? If you're going to say it's something benevolent or something like that, that's a further hypothesis into something that, let's say, is largely untestable. That so consciousness is received from some.
No, it's intrinsic, David. It's an intrinsic process. So it's not even a substance, it's a process. It's actually not even a process. It's the ground of processes. It's the most basic motion of a process. That's what reduction is.
It can't be tested. Meaning saying that its presence could be tested.
You could test it by here's how you could test it. You could do experiments with it as the model and do every other, like you'd have to meta-analyze models to test it. You'd have to say, well, here's like 1,000 different models. I'm going to test every single one of them and see which one makes the best predictions. And then you could start to go in that direction. But it's more complicated when you're talking about changing something like that on the level of framing.
Yeah, so some people, I think if Hameroff is more neutral on the topic, where if you're talking about the orchestrated objective reduction, and if it's, so to say, produced by by something internally to human anatomy, or whether it's received from something external to human anatomy, and how you're going to frame the understanding of the physics that the consensus opinion, even among the people who are leaning towards objective orchestrated reduction, is be that it's produced by something within human anatomy. It's not received from something external from human anatomy. If you're from the school, say panpsychism, it's implying that it's received, or if you're gonna, whatever word.
No, the consciousness would be intrinsic to the anatomy. So your anatomy is suffused with, quote, consciousness. You have a high level of conscious, and you undergo the process of consciousness in the same manner that all other systems undergo the process of consciousness. So the process of you thinking and the process of an electron undergoing reduction is fundamentally the same on the level of the process. But you're just far more complex in terms of the number of states you can reduce into. The electron can only reduce into the number of states that its basic geometry allows. You have the power to choose not just which states you go into, but how you go into them and other things through the, very advanced brain/human organ.
Yeah, so if you're purely talking orchestrated objective reduction as a physical theory, and it's just the reduction of electrons, and the electrons come from within the human anatomy or the
Some of the
environment.
scientists were
It's some
talking about a
form of
photon
sense
field.
perception as opposed to some sort of non-physical realm of classical dualism. So, I mean, that's what I say. Generally, orchestrated objective reduction is understood as a materialistic, non-dualistic explanation of consciousness, although it's more leaves open the possibility towards a more dualistic understanding than other theories.
I'll be honest, it's hard for me to follow when you start talking about dualism, because in a way, my thing is dualistic in that the proper geometries are unobservable. So you could say that my system defines some sort of a Platonic-esque realm where there are eternal forms that are unchanging.
What's what I mean, like you see people have to do their homework, and this stuff is extremely complicated, interdisciplinary study. Almost all of these people have PhDs and have done decades of research in one discipline. And then when you're talking about using philosophical or theological language, then you have to do your homework also to say, well, my theory, as opposed to having done your homework and knowing the canon I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Bruno as one of the precursors of thought for pantheism in the West. The intellectual father of Spinoza. Terminology is important. Saying advancing theories. Every one of the presenters here, had written papers, and gets into the heart of interdisciplinary studies, that if you have different terminology from different disciplines that are describing similar phenomenon, and the terms mean different things in the different studies. So if you've done your homework, you know the terms, and you know the different fields and how they're used, and you could navigate through that and advance a theory. And saying that that's where you really have to, for something like consciousness, it's a insurmountable amount of homework that a person has to do. And then if you're just like one of the participants at the conference, you would say like you only have 4 viewers, like tiny viewership. I saw the few people that had YouTube pages from the conference. Even the Harvard professor only had 200 subs. The one from one of the people today on the quantum state reduction only had 30 subs. It's not that interesting of a topic, and it's just tons and tons of homework and study. And if you're talking a degree in physics to neurobiology.
Well, physicists don't understand consciousness, so it's like who understands consciousness the best? Do you think that if we did a poll with those people that they would agree that someone is the expert on expert of experts on consciousness? I don't think
they could bring in David Chalmers, who is a philosopher. So really the experts
modern
on
philosophers tend to follow in lockstep with the interpretations of physics because of people like Hegel making physics and math out to be some sort of metaphysicsless, clean, pure, pristine, gosh knows what.
Not really. I would say the main propagators of consciousness still are philosophers, and they might try to make it correspond with physics, but no, I'm saying in the contemporary popular world, the main propagators of consciousness are philosophers that aren't really scientists, that might try their best to speak with scientists, to correspond with scientists, but are philosophers. And globally, not in the academy, the best understanders of consciousness are theologians, and generally it's sectarian. That philosophers in the academy tend to go to the Greeks, the Roman canon, the Western canon that focuses on the Greeks. But separate from that, the experts on consciousness are theologians, and you have some New Age theologians, like this program, even Jeffrey Mishalov, like the guy Straussman was into Zen Buddhism, and Kabbalah, Judaism. You have within sects, you have consciousness experts. They wouldn't use the term consciousness, like within Hinduism or Judaism. You have experts in meditation, or what we have the sectarian understanding according to Judaism, as said, like Hasidic rabbis don't use the word consciousness. There would be the Kabbalistic understanding of what they understand to be consciousness, which is a Greek term, and the academy, the universities, Greek, we use Greek terminology in the academy. Hindus also you're going to use their Sanskrit terminology to explain the phenomenon.
And it doesn't really translate because it's axiomatically quantum mechanical. If you look at something like Ayurveda, it's obviously axiomatically quantum mechanical if you know how to understand that stuff. So there wouldn't be a way to translate it. That's why these attempts are such atrocious train wrecks most of the time.
Yeah, so it doesn't exist. You have interfaith. Even Interfaith rarely gets into it. Like, I've attempted to get Interfaith to get more into these topics, but usually not. Like, unfortunately, Interfaith, if the on immigration or stop the hate type stuff that is common towards the use of interfaith, or even cosmology, or issues towards politics, or various things that might but a field, that's why I created the multiple truth hypothesis, but really there's no takers on that. And even in terms to you're like, okay, me as a Hindu, if I self-identify as a Hindu, I could talk to Hindus about Hinduism and consciousness, and then I'll have to demonstrate it through my knowledge of Hinduism, and then largely I leave Judaism out because it's not considered authoritative, although occasionally for reasons people will enter interfaith or try to have a mutual understanding of communication, but usually it's only cursory, that that people's interested. Like, I was on Jai Devi talking about reincarnation in Judaism, and it was more niche interesting that, Jews also believe in reincarnation. What's their concept of reincarnation? To have some sort of interfaith experience, but even that was relatively minimal to like a pure metaphysics of how do we understand the concept of reincarnation, and then like a multiple truth hypothesis classification, that this is the main school Hinduism understanding of the concept versus the Judaic understanding of the concept, and what are the metaphysical differences between the schools. And then you would have uncertainty and possibilities, that metaphysically there's multiple possibilities, and schools will choose one or a narrow portion of the possibilities, like Hinduism versus Judaism. And then you could see, logically, that it's possibly the phenomenon could be explained by a whole, host of spiritual explanations, and their traditions tend towards a narrow section of the possible explanations, and that's what you could get to through interfaith. And to some extent, interdisciplinary studies between the science is similar to interfaith in the process. And that's why I said the multiple truth hypothesis is really equally applicable to interfaith as towards scientific processes, because the same procedure of finding out the wide possibilities of a solution to an issue versus the narrow scope that a given tradition or discipline will take of all of the possibilities, and then comparing that and contrasting it with other disciplines that might have a different section of the scope for their definitions. I'm not sure if
Yeah,
that's
the thing I really like about it is that it's an active learning technique, and it seems to have improved your memory. Would you agree that, like, is your memory better than 10 years ago, or what do you think?
I mean, generally, memory, intellect favors the youth. So it's unclear if, like, how you define memory, like in terms of competitive
Like,
chess.
I'm way better at arguing now than I was 10 years ago because I just didn't argue that much 10 years ago. I mean, obviously, whatever. The
Yeah,
odd thing, but I wasn't
I mean,
performing
memory
great.
favors the youth, and even in a lot of these competitions and memory competitions, you'll even find extremely young kids, like even like 10 years old or something, that could be national champions at memory competitions. But so even if my memory is improving due to technique, that overall it's on certainly the amount of information I know now is more than I knew. I keep on reading and accumulating more information versus like a feat of memory of like memorizing digits, memorizing numbers, memorizing information that maybe I'm worse at it than I was previously. And also just to saying that it's a humility, in Hebrew called like a bittul yesh, a nullification of ego, to say my own ego, and this is the way I understand it. This is what I think is a block towards understanding and memorization.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
and so that's why if I'm chastising Jennifer for that, in terms of that, saying like, okay, just explain what these other people are saying. I know you have your own thoughts or your own understanding, but let's not focus on that for now. And so in that terms of memory, and I mentioned on Week in Review the chunking theory, where time appears to go faster as we get older, and relating to chunking. And if you wanted to put on the mystical concept of the nullification of ego, that the ego gets larger as we get older, and then so like chunking, but we have to filter things through our own ego, and then, well, that doesn't accord with my understanding, or how do I fit that data in with my understanding, as opposed to how do I just understand that data uh, regardless of how that fits in with my understanding.
Yeah.
And then even the process of trying to say, well, how does that match with my understanding, to even abstain from doing that period, to say, what is my understanding? Like I commonly say, I don't have an opinion. My opinion's meaningless. And if my mind would tell me to think something, I would generally shut my mind and try to have my mind prevent itself from trying to think an opinion. And so this process of trying to say,
Yeah, you
how does
just
that fit
never
in?
believe in it in the first
how,
place.
how does this fit in with I think, is actually a detriment to understanding and memory, to say,
Yeah.
well, I don't think anything. I just,
You just stop believing in it,
what
basically,
I
and
think
you
is just always
remember
wrong.
better.
And then so it's just an understanding of other systems where saying, well, I don't have my own beliefs, period. I just have conceptual understandings to the best of my ability uh, in my head.
Yeah, but those conceptual understandings function as beliefs, and everybody has something that functions as a belief just through the sheer repetition of being alive. So,
Well, I mean, really, you're advancing a hypothetical theory of consciousness that may or may not be accurate. So, I mean, in terms of the science of consciousness, you were talking, like, what they call hot higher order thinking. If you're calling those beliefs higher order thinking, you're saying everybody has beliefs, higher order thinking, and that could just be through repetition or through processing, analysis of sense perception, that there's higher order thinking, or it could be genetically innate through evolutionary processes, or
like,
however the origin
dogs
is.
have beliefs. The point, like, beliefs aren't unique to humans. It all arises together. Like, even something
Beliefs are
like a
hard to
single-celled
define.
organism would have a very, very rudimentary belief because it has a very rudimentary ego because it's a centralized form of intelligence.
Yeah, and so you're using, that's why it's interdisciplinary studies. Beliefs are a term from theology not from the science of consciousness. So if you're looking at a model of consciousness and you want to fit in, where do beliefs fit in? And so that's why I was mentioning higher order thinking. So, so if you're bringing in the
Yeah.
discipline of theology that posits something as beliefs, and then you're trying to do a science of consciousness interpretation, you say, well, we don't actually know whether beliefs exist or not. That's just something theologians attached to our understanding of mind that is likely inaccurate.
It's clear that something exists, whether beliefs the way we've defined them exist, because there's a pull towards it. It's just a question of how ought we define the term such that it lines up with basic biology, because there's a finite amount of energy in the complex of the mind body. So it's not like you can just have, infinitely many thoughts and that they're going to be meaningfully distinguished.
Yeah, so from the dualistic perspective, it doesn't have to line up with biology. And you're saying like, no, I mean, dog Pluto, I believe, if it's not, you just perceive that you believe, or you just have a voice in your head that tells you believe, but does that actually correlate to the controller or your higher order thoughts? Or is it just a vocalization of your higher order thoughts that is, could be evolutionary, it could be from your genetics, these origins of these higher level thoughts, or what I would advance, what I'm advancing is trunking theory, and possibly like a neural understanding of circuitry, that if the prefrontal cortex or certain parts of the cerebrum have circuits created in the neuron, that that's related to chunking theory, and like the nemrista, where the circuits are somehow formed from cognitive processes in a manner of chunking. So your beliefs is really just the vocalization of the circuitry. So you don't know the origins of your higher order thinking, of your beliefs, and saying there's, if you say it's genetic or it's chunked, it's based on self-perception, or if you want to claim that there's some sort of I that determined my own beliefs. But the science of
Basically, I would
consciousness
say we don't have
would mean more
access.
towards, it's a sub-vocalization of your
Yes.
the voice in your head, the perception of the controller is likely an illusion, so to say, and it's just a sub-vocalization of the higher order thinking. And if you want to take some sort of resonance, like Stephen Grossberg or what the guy King or whatever was saying earlier today, that's resonance, that you have your higher order thinking, and when there's more and more circuits in your brain that are wiring according to the same resonance, that will eventually lead to some sort of sub-vocalization of that becomes the voice in our head, and our perception that there's an I that believes. But in reality, that's an illusion. It's just that enough circuits were firing that it created a resonance of higher order thought, and that higher order thought became sub-vocalized, and that's could correspond to Hindu understanding of the mind. We're saying
Yeah,
ignore
you said
the
that.
voice
That
in
was
your
like
mind,
poetry. That was really poetic,
because the
almost.
voice in your mind is just a sub-vocalization of the resonance of higher order thought. It's not actually, like they're saying, like consciousness is illusion, and that corresponds to the Hindu kind of the trickery of your own mind, ignoring your own mind, and saying that, well, the Hindus were right, that the voice in our head is really just sub-vocalization of higher order thought.
Yeah, so I'm almost at the point of saying, like, let's just define beliefs as the things we don't have conscious access to, but that which give us the conscious experience, what you call the sub-vocalization. And that's where my theory would come in. I have the tripartite model of what actually are those subconscious beliefs that we don't have access to. And we've talked about that tons. I won't go into that now, but yeah, definitely the way you described it was quite good. Did you hear my description of the centralized self as an aid to compression, to searching the memory and the compression algorithm on my last stream? Was kind of reminded me of that, what you were saying just now.
Um,
Do you know what I'm talking about or no?
Yeah, I did watch that.
Because like
Although
we're
I'm not.
simulating the future, and then there's an additional simulation that gets made on top of so it's just purely a future simulation, and an additional simulator gets made, which is the centralizer of all those simulations, and which gives meaning to the simulations, such as to improve the memory retention, because like memories make, emotions make memories salient. It's like a cross-referential ordering principle where it entangles the emotions with the objects of sense experience that are coherently recognized.
Yeah, I mean, you probably define that better in saying, put like the emotions in term. I mean, you have to put in the hard work and start studying brain anatomy. And when you talk about emotions, if you're talking about, the reptilian brain or the centers of the brain, and the actual neural flow of, the actual electrical throw or signal control that it goes through the, certain center of the brain where emotions are, and then through thought, that thought would be filtered through the brain. And if you had primal directives of emotion, that action filters through emotion. And if it, like talk like fight or flight, or the various emotional centers, that like it has to have neural correlates. And emotion is also, has neural correlates. So you should probably do the hard work.
They're more corporeal correlates. Like there's not a whole lot of research done into the emotional connections with consciousness. They're still more at the stage of assessing the material substance, which, as some of us may know, is a wild goose chase.
But there are neural correlates of emotion, and saying the centers of the brain, and even the
There
process.
are, but like, how would you test that? I don't think most of those tests that would actually get at it would be ethical. Like, would that path, like, imagine something where you're trying to make someone cry as an experiment? Like, I don't see that passing an ethics board.
Well, I mean, you don't have to, God forbid, do unethical tests to have.
I'm
You could.
talking about measuring the emotional connection to consciousness. If you don't explore the range of emotions, how are you going to do that? If you don't explore bad emotions, how are you going to know it? And you don't really want to have to like induce those. And I don't think that would pass an ethics test. Is my point.
No, I mean, I participated in tests like that where, I mean, they could show you images or words, or you sign up as a student. I took I took psychology and was required to do at Stony Brook and participate in certain amounts of lab research that you could choose from the various ones. And just neuroimaging, or the various methods that they measure brain activity. And they will either usually show you images, or sometimes allow you to
Right.
freely
And
create the
there's no
emotion.
indicate, like, how do you establish what that means, what the brain's showing? I mean, it's a long way to go from image to brain.
Well, the same way for all the other neural correlates. The emotion, it would be the exact same thing for thought. They would just measure the emotional experience. Uh,
How the hell do you measure an emotional experience when most people can't even define a first thing about their emotions? You ever try to talk to someone about their emotions? Most people can't do that. But
yeah,
then to deny
I
that we
don't think
have
you're accurate.
emotions
I
is
don't think you're accurate
brilliant.
at saying like no. I mean, these things, these tests have already been done. I've even shared some of the studies. If you want to say, the exact accuracy, but you could show people
Sure.
pictures, or you could just freely ask a person to try to
But
elicit.
looking at a picture, David, what does that tell us about emotions is my question. Like, even if it's a picture of a happy face, is that like, that doesn't tell us about emotions, does it?
Yeah, it tells you where it occurs in the brain. The same way for
Oh,
thought, the
okay.
same
It
way for all
shows
the
you what
other.
the brain does as a result of looking at it. That's
We're,
a
talk, we're
reaction to a
talking the
picture,
neural
not an emotion.
correlates of consciousness. So you talk the neural correlates of emotion, and these things are already well defined and what they've been studied. In
How
fact,
did they induce the
the neural
emotion?
correlates of emotion were I believe they were discovered much earlier than the neural correlates of thought, or saying even thought in general is much more difficult than the neural correlates of emotion, because you have the reptilian brain that is more primal. And like the fear factor, that how do you know a person's in a state of fear, for certain, but it's saying like relatively it's and to some extent they've tested on rats and other species, and you have comparative anatomy among other animals that also suffer fear, but they know where the fear function. We know the neural correlates of emotions. I'm not sure what you're getting at. I'm saying that,
We've
like, within,
measured things. You don't understand that there's an issue with inducing emotions in an experimental setting, that would not necessarily mean anything.
you don't have to, God forbid, do like Nazi
I'm not
medical
talking about
experiment
that.
to induce fear.
Look,
You
here's
can have
here's one example.
to
I'll give
know
you an
the
example. I'm
neural
not okay.
correlates of fear. You don't have to do unethical experiments. They test this all the time, and it's saying, like, if just showing an image of something that induces fear, um, you're saying is
How
sufficient.
can you be guaranteed an image is going to induce
You
fear? Is
can't
my
be
point.
guaranteed. That's
Okay,
what I'm
so
saying.
it's
It's the
not.
neural
There's an
correlates of
issue with measuring
emotion.
it.
It's been well researched. Like, you need to do your homework.
It's been researched.
You need to do your
The
homework. And the
conclusions.
anatomy, the neural correlates of emotion are well understood. If you took neural anatomy, this has been well researched. It's well established. But you even theories of how decision making is filtered through thought and um, emotion. I mean, even Hamerov uh, talked about this in his so if you're talking thought in like the outer membrane and the and I mean, I just just to show, I'll do a quick um, like even in high school anatomy, you would learn this. Like even in high school biology, you already learn about the emotional center of the brain. Here you have the limbic system, the amygdala, the interactive center of emotions, emotional behavior, and motivation. The brain is turned upside down, and the end of the structure, continuous to the hippocampus, is called the uncus. If you peel away the uncus, you'll expose the amygdala, which abuts the anterior of the hippocampus. And so the neural correlates, so to say, of consciousness of emotion. This has been tested, well established. It's basic emotion, and the pathway of decision making goes through the amygdala. If you want to talk the outer brain where thought occurs, that thought is filtered through emotion, and they call the reptilian brain. And like, no, we have to do our homework. Do the brain anatomy, understand this stuff. That's talk about the importance of interdisciplinary studies. If you want to be serious about talking about consciousness, you have to learn the brain anatomy, and the brain anatomy is complicated. Saying like you have a lot of these people have PhDs in neurophysiology and various things, but what's already been tested and understood. And if you're talking about like interdisciplinary studies, when things have meaning according to theology and philosophy, and then they have meaning according to biology, and then how do you establish that testing it, and if what is it, is it conclusively, and because you want to advance your theological understanding, you're going to dispute the accepted biological understanding
I'm not trying
that
to advance my understanding. I'm trying to help people see why the way some questions are currently phrased are not resolvable. And I thought the fastest way to that would be to give the correct interpretation, but clearly that was not going to work here. So reframe.
Yeah, but you just got to do your homework.
Yeah.
And it's
What
either.
does knowing about the brain, what is that going to change about knowing about consciousness? We don't have an understanding of consciousness. We have an understanding of the brain. We have a very good understanding of the brain. But that's not giving us the understanding of consciousness.
Well, I'm saying we have a substantial understanding of aspects of consciousness. We don't have a theory of the totality of consciousness, and there's competitive models, but it's saying like the large aspects of consciousness are to some extent completely understood in terms of like qualia and various qualia and sense perception, like memes where the I equals the I. And that I was talking about memory techniques and visualization, that almost 40% of the brain is used for visual processing. That's why memory techniques focus on visualizing or connecting things to images. And if you're talking like a subvocalization of the I, is the subvocalization of resonance of the majority of my brain, or the higher resonance of the majority of my current brain function, that comes into a subvocalization of the voice in my head that would be the I, and that is mostly based on visual perception. That if there is some sort of resonance, that a single resonance will become dominant and then become subvocalized in the head as the I, that is majority caused by visual input.
That is an absolutely reasonable supposition, and it would even be reasonable to go a step further and say that 40% of it is from that. But I don't think that would end up panning out. But it'd be a good first guess.
But the control, like the how the when the centers of the brain that process sense information, sense perception, are directed to the body, they pass through the amygdala and the reptilian brain that controls emotion. So, like decision making of what I do with my body, even if it's based on thought that, according to a materialistic understanding, is being processed in parts of my brain, for it to go to action, it has to go through the amygdala and the emotional processing centers. And similar way to
You're
thought, we
acting
don't.
like it's a circuit. It's a quantum circuit. So the brain is only one part of that relay arc.
Well, that's the general understanding. So it's the opposite of anthropomorphization, where we're mapping the computer, but certain aspects of consciousness are basically completely understood. And there's uncertainty at all levels, but like you talk like pressure and touch sensors that we have throughout our body, and then the neural system, the somatic sensory system is largely understood. I mean, there's elements of uncertainty, but in terms of a relay of how sense perception from levels of our body hit our brain, how it travels to our brain, and then how those circuits travel back to the parts of the body to cause movement, is pretty well understood. That's that's not that you call that a qualia.
They're just corporeal correlates of consciousness. We don't understand them in the context of the generating consciousness. Clearly.
Well, that's what we say. Does consciousness may not need that? If you touch something hot and then remove your hand, that may or may not require consciousness. As I said,
like what it makes sense to look at the
that could
brain
be
as
exactly
an amplifier of
analogous
consciousness.
to a
That
Boolean
when it lights
circuit.
up like that, it's sending information from the body to the mind. That's what it makes sense to think of as what the brain is an amplifier for sensations.
Well, I said like when a reflex action could be understood exactly analogous to a Boolean circuit, no difference. That to some extent, that's the mainstream medical understanding, that reflexes and certain aspects of sense perception operate purely like Boolean circuits, And
Well, that's
there,
the idea with nerve cells, isn't it?
it
When you
doesn't
have the
even require
differential
the
charge.
controller. That reflex doesn't require the controller. That just goes straight to the amygdala without going through thought processing, and causes a reaction or like fight or flight, various actions or bodily perception to fear. If someone sees something scary, and then the aspects related to the emotion of fear in terms of the hormones that are released, and the uh, influence that has on the body, if it makes people sweat or heartbeat faster, or various things that if you say that doesn't require consciousness, or that it's algorithmic, and it
I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying whatever model we accept for consciousness is we're going to presuppose a model we go to test. And so if we test a model that we presuppose and it seems like it's right, we're not really sure why it's right necessarily, because it could be that 10 or a million models might be right, but all technically different. That's my point, is that we don't have an understanding of what does it mean that the brain is reacting to sense experiences in the context of the consciousness. We're saying, well, it's the same thing, and that doesn't really work. But yeah, we definitely do tend to think in a way that I would describe as Boolean. So good to keep bringing that up for sure.
Yeah, so you see the count. I mean, it's really like all work and no pay, to in terms of so if you want to stick to theology, or a subdiscipline, like whatever you had interest in physics, but you're more in the school of theology. um and even theology to some extent is all work and no pay, and you have to really
Well, in
love the
my
subject.
understanding, philosophy is secular theology, and then science is an application of philosophy. So they all go together. But I do think the understanding we have of material science can have something to say about the other two on the level of a verification criterion.
That's so like a memory technique, a mental technique. You can say, okay, it's not all work and no pay, and because there's a payoff to the benefit of learning a technique, having improved memory or mental capacity. But generally, working to understand these things is all work and no pay, and it's all homework, and there's no waiting audiences. See, we have one of my smallest audiences talking about this, and you can even see the experts, biggest experts in the field. Um, you have very little audience, and even the people who talk about these subjects get a much more bigger audience when they talk about the less scientific related topics that are more interesting to people. So
Consciousness has nothing to do with theology necessarily. It's just consciousness. I guess it just sounds theological, but it isn't. It's just consciousness.
well, I mean, it's a Greek word that
Panpsychism is not a theological position.
they're all theology. They derive from Greek
Panpsychism is actually
theology.
the theocratic position.
By saying the terminology of all of these derive from, you could call Greek philosophy, but I mean, Greek philosophy is really Greek theology, and I mean, there's a reason why that all of these words are explained with Greek terms, and that's why I say, okay, if you're in yeshiva and you know the Hebrew, you don't translate to another language, but it's a sectarian understanding, and it's based on scripture and some sort of tradition. Why the Greek became the dominant academic terminology is interesting. How you understand theology, philosophy, also Greek terms, for a generalization of the application of these ideas. But I just use the word like theology or philosophy, that those are not material sciences. They're realms of pure thought, abstract thought, that may or may not have connection to the material realm. And if, from a theological application, you say, okay, thought, and that's why I always talk Platonic versus Aristotelian, where that's why I created the multiple truth hypothesis, because um, it's near impossible to navigate all of these conflicting theories and understanding, and just the concept of what does interdisciplinary studies even mean? How do you conduct it? What is the science of consciousness conference? It's just a bunch of people giving talks. There's really nothing more to it. There's no real conversation. There's no real progress. It's just a bunch of experts from different fields giving a bunch of talks with a tiny bit of Q&A at the end. And the Q&A at the end is basically limited to the discipline. And when the question's outside of the discipline, the person usually just says, that's not my discipline. And, so why don't you ask the question to someone who that's their discipline? So, I mean,
You realize at some point it's the same thing as, the definitional self-regress, that everyone's just going to keep passing the buck at some point between the philosophy people and the physics people and the, theology people. I mean, I guess the theology people are the ones running with it.
Yeah, when you take, like convert to Hinduism, because Hinduism has a unified approach.
Well, it would be nice if it wasn't just theology that was talking about consciousness. It would be nice if material science could talk about consciousness and calibrate some of the unhealthy stuff that comes out of theology sometimes.
It was like Charles Moskowitz, really, what he said, like, well, like God explains consciousness. And it's like, well, I agree with you, but like God, that's not a theory.
Well, exactly. Theology is not about theories. Theology is pretty much just like the bare fundamental level of everything.
I'm saying, like Kabbalah, Charles answered like, well, God explains consciousness. That saying sectarianism.
Most people have said that throughout history and been totally fine with it. Just saying,
well,
not saying I'm fine with it, but
that Hinduism and Judaism or Christianity have schools that have exact explanations that are theological, based on the authority of tradition and personalities that described dualistic systems. So, I mean, the Kabbalists don't just say, well, God explains consciousness. They actually have a Kabbalistic system that, is, say, Platonic dualistic in nature, that explains consciousness. You're just saying, well, God, there's some sort of working system that in theory is even scientific and could produce results, at least on an introspective measure. And from a mystical perspective, like magic works. Like, Bruno in his book talked about magic and the ability of really understanding these topics to be able to produce miracles. And magic, just like a lot of the Kabbalists or the Hindus, saying it's not just you could look at it as an unprovable theological system that explains how the spiritual is manifested in the material. But once you say that it's scientific, then you get to the point, well, let's see some miracles, let's see you prove it. And from that point, if you're sectarian, be like, yes, I believe in miracles. Yes, the sages did miracles. They understood this stuff and they did miracles. And why that can't be tested in the larger scientific, or even you have some Hindus that will claim like, yes, these yogis really can do these miracles and it's been tested in the lab, or some sort of measurement problem where, if you're measuring it, they can't demonstrate these miracles, but really they can do these miracles. And it's it's problematic, the nature of theology and interfaith and interdisciplinary, even if you, because most interdisciplinary studies, science of consciousness, doesn't include theology. They had neurospirituality, and it was unclear, like, even like Craftsman was even like none of them were, so the Science of Consciousness Conference has a few philosophers. It doesn't have any theologians. And if they had theologians, it would have to become like an interfaith where they have to have like a Hindu.
We're the closest thing to that, maybe.
Well, we're not part of it. We're just paid.
That's why I said we're the closest. That we weren't actually theologians, but that we were the closest. That conference was getting to having theologians at it.
Well, I mean, there's always been an interest that, I think Hamarov, because they have to pay for it. And he said that himself, that on one of the interviews I shared in Week in Review, that there's a lot of spiritualists and religious people that pay to go to the conference, and that's part of the support network that allows the conference to exist. But we're not part of the conference. We're just watching the conference, and we're listening to scientists.
Yeah, that's true. I'm aware of that fact concerning the conference, is that we're only attending it and not.
And even Deepak Chopra, like saying, like, he's more. I mean, he has some Hindu leanings, but like, no, he's a medical doctor who studied physics at Harvard, and even if he has Hindu leanings, he's more likely to talk about Jesus than Hinduism, and it's kind of like New Age. It's unclear. I mean, so actually, in a few minutes, so we'll wrap up now. So maybe tomorrow.
Yeah, well, we'll see what's up with that. We're about to go check it out. It's happening in 4 minutes, and we'll report back. David, are we doing another show?
We'll see tomorrow. We'll be in touch. So I think the conference ends at like 9 or 9:30 my time, and there's no night program. So if there's what to talk about, at pretty low viewership. So we'll see if the likelihood that anyone will join the conversation, or that anybody from the conference would like.
What about just having non-attachment to the viewer numbers and just trying to make the best show? Because maybe the complaining is not the greatest thing to bring in viewers.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I mean, there has to be a value proposition for us and the even the viewership to make it public. And saying, me and you, we just wanted to talk about it to make it public, that there's going to be even.
How can your self-esteem be so low that you don't think a public convo about the topics is valuable for its own sake? I don't get that. But anyway, to be continued. We will continue our ongoing infinity conversation very soon, audience. Can't wait till the next time.
Yeah, saying that we want to report on the conference or for each other, that we're saying we split up, and saying, because I didn't go to all the sessions that you went to, and then you could, kind of report to me. I report to you what we heard at the other sessions. So we'll talk in message tomorrow and see what's happening. And if anyone from the conference is watching, so maybe there'll be an interesting chat for the Deepak Chopra session. So appreciate you having this talk. I hope you're enjoying the conference. And like I'm doing my homework. I'm reading books. I'm constantly studying this, even if there's not really interest in the content I put out on the subject. There's probably more demand for me to talk about Judaism than consciousness. But most of the rabbis were really into this. Like even Hameroff. There's a lot of people that that I want to understand Judaism and Kabbalah and theology better, and I study science, like Maimonides says, to augment my understanding of theology. And if you're a medicine, like the Ahimsa principle, I subscribe to the Ahimsa principle, and like a doctor, that I study this stuff because I want to be able to help people and limit their suffering. For my own health, I want to live a long and healthy life, and I want to help other people. And understanding this stuff is important. So I'm glad at least I found someone, Jennifer, that also finds this interesting. Even she's the only one I ever met. I haven't even met her, but just over the internet, that actually finds this stuff interesting. So appreciate it. Let Jennifer say final word.
Of course, this is the kind of thing that this is my bread and butter. Sitting around talking about consciousness. I could do this forever.
Okay, so gonna end the program, and we'll tune into Deepak Chopra, and hopefully we'll talk more tomorrow.